Welcome to the ONEder Podcast. This is your host, CCB, and I am delighted to have a conversation today with one of our 2024 ONEder Grant award-winning teams. I want to take a little minute and explain the ONEder Grant in general. It's a research grant that's given to architects and designers to work on new or evolving research around design and the human experience. And since 2019, we have given out 24 ONEder Grants to design firms across the state of California and Washington. This year, we have 3 teams, and we will have 3 podcasts with each one of the teams describing their research in a little bit more greater detail. So it's really delightful to be able to kind of pick apart what amazing work each one of these teams have done. And today's team that we're speaking with is Board and Vellum from the Seattle area. And we have Lance and Yi-Chun from Board and Vellum. And I'm going to say, welcome, Lance. You introduce yourself first.
Perfect. Thanks, CCB. Yeah, so my name is Lance Hayes. I've been with Board and Vellum now for about nearly 10 years, closing in on 10 years. I'm a generalist architect. I've sort of worked in the Seattle area for quite a bit longer than that. Originally, I was from Montana, I always like to say, so I worked in Montana a little bit and some other places around the country. But found myself here in the Seattle area and find that it's just a really interesting place to work. And there's a lot of engaging things and people and nature and all the things, which is really fantastic. My interest actually partially in sort of this research and the study as well was it seemed like the things that sort of happened, post-COVID and during that transition really got us all kind of in this hybrid mindset and all these different things that we had to consider. And it really changed sort of our mindset for how we think about work. And I think that was part of our sort of angle on sort of doing some of our research was we're like, things change so fast and we were just kind of working on the fly on a lot of things. And we wanted to get to the root of how and why and maybe betterment, in general. We're always trying the cycle of improvement, the cycle of design, we find a lot of times is that cycle of improvement. And so that's kind of our angle. And that's kind of what we hope to uncover. So.
Well, I think you're going to do an amazing job. I know you are going to do an amazing job. And I am going to ask Yi-Chun to introduce herself and give us a little bit more information about Board and Vellum.
Thank you, CCB, and pleasure to be here. Thank you for making the time. We're so excited to be sharing some of our findings with you all. And hello, everyone. I am Yi-Chun Lin. I am the Director of Architecture, Landscape and Site Design at Board and Vellum. I've been with Board and Vellum for about quite as long as Lance, but for about 5 years at this point. We are a multidisciplinary firm where we have landscape architect, interior designers, and as well as architects in the office. And so it's really sort of a bit of a playground of all things that we get to collaborate and design and just a platform for us to think about ways to really make the world more beautiful and hopefully along the way as advocates for our clients and for ideas and for placemaking that truly resonate with our environment, with our neighbors and with our communities at large. A little bit about me, I've been in the Seattle area for a number of years. I've bounced around quite a bit previously in parts of Asia and a little bit in Europe, and it's been and also really on the realm of my professional side of things, where my degree is in architecture, but I've had the opportunity to really get to play in the landscape architecture realm, and also dabble a little bit in the interior design, marketing, and really I think having the opportunity to culminate these experiences together, both physically and also from the experience side of things, has really led me to a level of just curiosity in terms of how that is leading to and how it really applies to the theme of this grant. That as someone who in some ways have always not been the one that's from that area that I'm in, that it's about learning another language. It's about figuring out how to build connection with someone else across the table that we might not share the same exact way of communicating with each other, but how do we form bonds with each other and attachments that would hopefully allow us to really build something together and experience something wonderful and that our world has to share. And so that, especially like Lance said, in light of the pandemic and this shared experience that we all have, but also such drastic different ways of how we individually internalize that experience and how it's expressed outward. And that's really been a catalyst to my personal interest of figuring out how do we attach and form that attachment, and how do we then elevate it in the way that for us to really build long-lasting bonds with each other.
Pretty broad sounding as you start to describe this. And I will say that when we are working with the grant teams, often there is a giant hypothesis or area of concern. And it's always delightful and fascinating to watch the research become more focused and easier to explain, I'm going to say. And so if the title of your grant is The Power of Workplace Attachment in a Hybrid World, workplace attachment is often associated with in-person environments. So how did the research you set out to compile, how did it define that, in today's world with so much hybrid activity going on?
I'll jump in here first. I think so. I think we had an interesting sort of aspect where we were trying to wrangle, kind of like you said, CCB, as much as we could, sort of initially, where we're like, okay, so who's our audience? How broad is it going to be? Like, how much outreach are we going to have? Are they going to be mostly remote? Are they going to be mostly hybrid? Are they going to be mostly in person? And what we found is we kind of hit the spectrum of folks when we were doing the research, which we actually thought was even more valuable. We're like, fantastic, this is great. We can really start to get at the root, hopefully, of some of these different things. And I think what we found through all of that is that there are some of the similar markers, sort of depending, regardless of your situation, there are some of the similarities of sort of interest and behavior of attachment types that sort of really jumped out to us and leaped out. And we found this to some degree between sort of area, category in the workplace, or maybe even generation, sort of employee, sort of, whether you're mid-level as beginning or sort of like senior employee and so forth. And so I think for us, it was kind of like starting to assess again what the pathway through all that was and how it started to coalesce in terms of becoming some obvious sort of signal from all the potential noise that we were going to accumulate.
The net that you cast was over these groups that Lance is referring to, but what did that look like? What actually makes up the net that you throw over?
That net was so, in some ways, like what Lance said, is we sort of took the approach of if we bought a basket that was big enough that when we go travel, maybe we'll bring something back. But it was challenging. It was challenging to decide. And to your point of, it's a really broad topic. And so how do we really look at who our audience could be and how might they even respond to a set of questions that would give us data that we feel could potentially allow us to draw some level of conclusion, not sort of preconceived, but at least one of the pieces that it kept coming up was how fatigue and survey fatigue everybody probably is at this point. And we actually took a look at the Strength Finder, the Gallup Strength Finder, which is something that one of the surveys that we take at BMV, like many other organizations, in an effort to understand what people's kind of native way of motivators are, and in sort of balancing that, realizing that how do we really make our survey and the net that we're casting as friendly and also as conversational and in some ways as accessible as possible, so that someone could be on perhaps in their hybrid days of taking a train in, that they can go through the survey and in 2 minutes time between stops, they can be done, and that they don't have to, they don't really have to be thinking too terribly much about, shoot, this is going to be taking me so long, and that we are not getting that a bit of a inherent and very instinctive reaction to the answer. And then the other side of it was that we didn't really categorize folks as really sort of as specific categories. And the thought for that, and we know that, with the other, that there ends up being a lot of people that falls into those specific category other than perhaps the design profession or some sort of service-oriented or manufacturing and other types. But we felt that the cohesive portion of it is that how would people perceive the way that we would want to ask them to think about themselves and think about their workplace. And so the question is at times very intimate, but at times so broad so that we can ask people to almost zoom in on the micro and the macro and the flip of a few different questions, so that it allows that organicness in the design, so it doesn't feel like someone is trying to preset certain notion on how they should be answering something. But it was challenging. It was very challenging, and thanks to CCB's guidance, because we felt like so many times during the coaching session, it was like, okay, those are really helpful, but how are you zooming in? And I think we were definitely experiment within an experiment, and at times just thinking, oh my gosh, we were like a little bit of a beautiful mind of all the things on the wall, but we didn't really quite know what we were zooming into.
So for our listening audience, when firms are awarded a ONEder Grant, we also from One Workplace assign grant coaches. And I'm putting air quotes around that. And the coach's responsibility is to just hopefully help keep the research project on schedule, because you have a 6-month window to be able to do all of this, but then also to find additional resources that potentially could help any of the teams working on the project that they're working on. And I fortunately was able to work with Board and Vellum on this particular grant. And the nature of workplace attachment and attachment theory in general, I find fascinating. And the idea of, in a fairly disrupted environment, to how do we kind of grab hold of as much knowledge about how human behavior that we possibly can, in order to inform designing better spaces or making better recommendations to the folks that we work with. So it was definitely an adventure of just so many thoughts and theories and philosophies, and and how do you draw the line around what exactly you want to do. So you did all of that research and you thought through remarkable numbers of combinations of things. And then you came down to building the survey the way that you wanted to build the survey. And you identified some level of category. And I'd love you to share kind of what those are and what the thought was behind the choices that you made.
I'll start off here, and Yi-Chun, please sort of fill in. But I feel like we had a sort of a couple of ways of sort of setting up the kind of the approach toward the survey. I think the one was like, obviously we wanted to kind of understand our audience as best as possible, right? And so we have this, what we call kind of like a first half of sort of getting to know the audience, who is the audience in terms of where they fall in the categories of, say, whether it's the service industry or manufacturing, and how long they've been working, and they're, those sorts of categories that are fairly sort of generic, but also allow people to sort of be put into a space where we can then understand how they relate to the second part, which is the more friendly and approachable part, I think, that Yi-Chun was really talking about, which is like, hey, kind of help us problem solve and figure out, like, how does attachment workplace work for you, right? And to some degree, hopefully, by sort of creating an infrastructure which is to some degree disarming and to some degree problem solving, we were able to create a series of scenarios which allowed folks to kind of fall into almost like a choose your own adventure style of sort of like making their way through a question set that would allow them to be like, hey, like, how do I think about this in the workplace, and so forth. And anecdotally, we had this really interesting thing that Yi-Chun brought up a while back, which is this contractor reached out to us and he's like, hey, this looks like a really specific problem that maybe Board and Vellum sent me the wrong thing. Like, I'm trying to solve this problem. I think maybe I should bring this to my firm and ask them what the deal is. And we're like, wow, this is strange, but great, because on one hand, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And on the other hand, it's like, keep taking it. You're doing great, like help us solve this stuff. So really fun stuff. But I feel like those two aspects of it really allowed us to kind of like, not just kind of, get the net sort of where it needed to be, but also to then sort of figure out like, hey, where are things settling within there, and how do we actually understand how to interpret it a little bit better.
The other thing I'm going to give you credit for is recognizing that it's a snapshot. When you're taking these, these surveys and you're collecting this information about these groups of folks and the attachments that they are defining, kind of about how they feel about their affiliation with their workplace, there's a bit of ephemeral nature to it, that it is what it is, and it helps you understand today and then continue the conversation, which I thought was clever in design, to be able to continue that conversation, like the general contractor example, but then also bring up other questions that are kind of embedded in it. And I'd love for one of you to talk about that. I know there was a conversation we had about what role does leadership have in fostering attachment within the workplace, and how do the survey results kind of help them be more informed?
I think for that, from what Lance was talking about, that anecdotal, that portion of it, and what really in some ways inform our toolkit approach at the end, is that I think more often than not, and perhaps using myself as an example, that whether when we're evolving ourselves and or with others, that it's no matter what the interactions, it's almost always that it is that moment in time, that snapshot in that particular interaction. And so sometimes things are just ripened for those positive interaction, those attachments to form. But then other times, it's more often than not, and in my humble opinion, is that it's not a matter of not wanting. It's more about not knowing how. And so the toolkit approach and how that relates to perhaps the leadership team and firms being able to set the tone for that interaction. One of the things that I have always thought of is that someone who really is fortunate to be in a position to be someone's manager or get to guide someone somewhere along their career and trajectory, is that it's in service of, but it's about building the environment for my team. And so to build that environment, it also means having that situation and place awareness, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I know how to ask the questions to perhaps elicit the exact thing that someone else needs, because I won't understand what I don't understand. And so part of the grant and how we've evolved it is really kind of taking a layer and a look into the generational aspect of it. It's not to say that we're so bracketed around the generation aspect of it, but it's more about embracing that our workforce, which is really folks are retiring later, and some folks are in some ways entering the workforce earlier, depending on whatever circumstances, and be it trade, professional, others. And so we're really spanning such a big range in terms of our immediate workforce over the next, in the past 5 years in the pandemic, and also over the next 10 plus and 20, 30 plus years, and how it's evolving. And earlier when, I talked a little bit about kind of my background of living in different places where not my native language. And I remember as a 14-year-old carrying around a dictionary, trying to understand what someone else is saying, because I didn't even quite understand what I was saying, and whether the sentence was making sense. But having the dictionary sort of was a toolkit that allowed me to take something and point to someone and said, I think this is what I'm saying, but is it really, are you interpreting it as what I'm saying? And so that almost that act of asking help and the willingness to ask help to create that bridging connection I think that it forms that the start of making of the environment, and how that ties in with folks that are working with each other with the leadership team is it hopefully creates a point of conversation that allows everyone to sort of have that dictionary moment of, does it seem like the thing that I think it's saying, and if it isn't, please help me, because I would love to evolve and grow, and so that we can grow towards each other.
There's a continuous thread through all of the grants this year, which is about clarity in language, in definition. It's asking for understanding, which means there has to be, as you're pointing out, Yi-Chun, a clarity. Do we understand the terms that we're using? Do we mean the same thing by what we're describing? And so I think that's pretty fascinating. Reflective of kind of a disruptive environment, the chaos that we've all been involved in over the last 5 years or 6 years, that we know intuitively, we know that we want to understand what we're talking about in a way that we perhaps just sailed along before and assumed that we were having the same conversation or talking about the same thing. So I want to also remind our listeners that on the ONEder Grant website, there will be all of the links to the full research report. So you'll be able to see in much greater detail, or read in much greater detail, and see some of the diagrams in the survey that our team is referencing right now. And there also are like single page abstracts. So if you really wanted to kind of get a clarity of this is what we were talking about, know that is available. And there will be links to Board and Vellum and to Yi-Chun and to Lance so that you can connect for more conversations. So all that being said, there's all this research and, kind of based on your findings, where's your next step? What are you going to do with the information that you have, and what's kind of the plan for, any kind of continuation of the search?
That's funny because Yi-Chun and I were just talking beforehand. We were talking about some aspect of it, and we're like, Yi-Chun, this is next year's sort of research. We're already onto it, and so like we were just debating. We're like, this feels unfair to bring this up on the podcast as a leveraging technique.
We like to help you keep, continue. We like it.
No, that's definitely the nature of it. It feels like, because almost like you were saying earlier, CCB, this is it just inherently by definition is sort of a snapshot in time, right? Because of that, you sort of want to dig into any particular aspect of it and figure out a little more about it. But I think in terms of the definition of things as well, like we were trying to sort of categorize things as well as we could in terms of these kind of 4 categories, which we thought sort of had a broad cast in terms of understanding the workplace and its environment, whether they're professional, physical, normative, or social. Those sort of aspects of it seemed like they were good catch basins for all of the information. And then really it's about the kind of the audience and the change over time, right? Sort of how that actually swings. We were wondering, we're like, oh, this is 2024 snapshot, but imagine 2027 snapshot, or, whatever it is in the future. It might look somewhat different, and then we might be able to try to figure out how to get to the root of why it's appearing differently, and sort of how we can use maybe the toolkit or other sorts of conversation starters as mechanisms to kind of help that along. One of the other things I wanted to kind of note from before, which I thought was just an interesting aspect, is this kind of works top down, bottom up, anywhere in between. Like we're sort of reaching to the audience, sort of not just to say, oh, how does leadership going to sort of construct something for you? But we're treating a beginning employee as well as sort of like, how would you go about solving this issue? Like it's kind of like leadership from all directions. And we thought that was also an interesting angle within the research.
I had like a negative question it was the way that the question I wrote it is negative, and I don't want to say it this way. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I say, what are the benefits? You've been talking about them, but if you were going to offer this to a client that you were working with, how would you describe the benefits, the output that they would receive?
Oh, interesting. Go for it, Yi-Chun.
The first thing that comes to mind is really about retention. For folks this is something that we have also shared in our report that will be on the website, is that looking at folks that have been around in the organization and have been working with each other for a while, that there's a level of trust and there's a level of just connection that is very different, and it takes time to form that. And for an effective team to really take risks together, regardless of where people are in their career, that having the social connection that are reinforced with, whether it's professional, normative, or physical dimensions that works for any specific individual, that allows really a way for people to bridge with one another. And one of the questions that we had in our survey was that if someone were to offer you better compensation, would you leave? But it starts to sort of distill down into people actually don't necessarily leave. They are really happy with the environment that they're in, and that people are looking at it really globally as an overall experience, really akin to almost like in a partner and or in a relationship, that there are always going to be some give and takes, and that there's always kind of a places hopefully that we're making new mistakes together. But the retention aspect of it, the retraining, that is such a huge both, I think, cost saving and also ways for companies to level up.
Mm-hmm. I also had another interesting question, because I don't know that we actually ever talked about this, but do you have in your mind what an attachment conscious workplace design looks like?
Oh man, let me jump in on this one first, because I think
Lance is trying to gonna put another grant interest in there for 2020.
So many grants, so many different aspects. No, I think initially when we were talking about this, we were debating internally sort of like all the different angles we were interested in taking on the research and so forth. And my initial instinct and thought was that this would basically help us come to some real conclusion, like real specific conclusions on, say, the physical environment of how we would design spaces to contribute to well-being in the workplace. And I think almost a too literal fashion, right? Where I was just like, oh man, we got to like put a skylight in the break room. I mean, obviously it couldn't be that like direct, but the idea of sort of like how you start to structure spaces around that seemed like obviously it's in our wheelhouse as designers to consider that type of stuff. I feel like the data we got to some degree does reinforce a series of decisions for things like that. And I think the thing that a little bit was surprising to me is that the social pathway through all of the research was by far, I would say, the predominant factor. And so in how we might put together spaces, that would then suggest sort of means for sort of going about organizing your spaces in such a way that you contribute to that aspect of the research. Even more so than even the physical sort of nature of things, which might contribute to things like the actual workspace design, or some of the some more manifest sort of material aspects of the design itself.
I do think because we have been using the word environments and not really tying it specifically, it's been very implicit, but culture. That word, we haven't said it really in this conversation, but truly, when you're talking about that whole social nature and I know that comes out in the report. How does an organization build the feeling, that environment, or, the culture, if you will, to keep people attached, affiliated? So I'm going to say, holy smoly, it is, it's end time of the conversation. And always these conversations for me are like, we didn't talk about half of what we wanted to talk about. However, I encourage all of our listeners to really dive over to the ONEder Grant webpage. It's on the www.oneworkplace.com under ONEder, ONEder, and you'll be able to dive into all of this research in much greater detail. I love, though, closing by saying, if you each had one key takeaway from your research, like one real nugget, what would that be that you would share with this audience?
I think for me that it's tied in sort of two components. It's being curious and being aware, and that I have a pin that's on my backpack that reminds me to save time to play. And I think that so much of the workplace, and as well as our other aspect of all of our lives, that there's that curiosity just has it oftentimes opens so many doors. And while our report and our findings are a snapshot in place, that we hope it piques someone's interest, and that opens their eyes a little bit, or just maybe raise their eye just a tiny bit, that for them to take another look and see if they are able to use this as a way to foster more of that time and creativity.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that sort of stood out was that to some degree, this research is suggesting like a level of self-empowerment, sort of through like creating your own sort of like workplace, because to some degree, whether you're hybrid or remote or sort of like in a physical person, it's kind of about developing those relationships and developing this sort of working rapport and a lot of those types of elements that really strengthen your experience overall. And certainly, the other elements are going to contribute towards fostering a better workplace overall and greater attachment. But that seemed like it was an excellent sort of nugget and takeaway.
Thank you very much, Lance and Yi-Chun. And I'm going to say the power of workplace attachment in a hybrid world is certainly something that all of us are going to want to spend a little bit more time thinking about. And you now have some tools delivered by our friends from Board and Vellum to be able to give some more dimension to this search. We're grateful for the time that you've spent with us, for the time that you did on your research, and for sharing that with One Workplace and the broader design community. And I'm going to say thank you and sign off from the ONEder Podcast. Bye-bye.